April 9, 1943. Near Maknessi, Tunisia. The desert wind howled across the low, stony ridges of central Tunisia. The air shimmered with heat and dust as the last of the German 10th Panzer Division fought to hold a crumbling line against the advancing Americans. Shell bursts rippled through the dunes, and the sound of M4 Shermans rumbled like distant thunder. Lieutenant Karl Hoffmann pressed himself against the burnt-out wreck of his SD, KFZ, 251 half-track, his uniform streaked with soot and sweat. Only hours earlier, he had been commanding a reconnaissance unit, confident, proud, loyal to the Reich and to the ideals drilled into him since youth, discipline, order, and racial hierarchy. Now, as tracer fire streaked through the twilight sky, he could see his unit collapsing. The Americans were closing in, their tanks flanking wide, infantry moving with unnerving precision. Zurückziehen! Pull back, someone shouted. But it was too late. Through the haze, a figure appeared, an American GI, his rifle leveled, the steel glint of a bayonet fixed. Behind him, more soldiers fanned out in formation. They moved with a rhythm Hoffmann had not expected, efficient, deliberate, yet strangely relaxed compared to the rigid German drills he knew. He hesitated, pistol in hand, until another soldier shouted from the American line. "Hands up! Drop your weapon!" The tone was firm, but not cruel. Hoffmann's heart pounded. The sound of tank engines grew louder, and suddenly a massive shadow rolled up over the ridge, a Sherman, its gun swinging lazily toward his position. He dropped his pistol into the sand and raised his hands. Within minutes, he and what remained of his platoon were surrounded. Dozens of exhausted, dust-covered German soldiers now stood in a makeshift holding area, guarded by men in olive-drab uniforms. Some of the guards were white, others were not. That was the first shock. Private Gunther Riedel, standing next to Hoffmann, whispered, "Sind das Neger? Are those Negroes?" His tone mixed disbelief with something close to fear. Two African-American soldiers, members of the 93rd Infantry Division Service Detachment, walked past, checking rifles and collecting weapons from the surrendered Germans. Their uniforms were identical to those of their white comrades. Their boots, rifles, helmets, all standard issue. No sign of inferiority. No sign of servitude. To Hoffmann's mind, trained on years of Nazi propaganda films depicting racial purity, the scene was impossible. These men were not the caricatures from Goebbels' posters. They were disciplined soldiers, calm, professional, and clearly respected by their unit. As the Americans loaded the prisoners onto trucks, one of the black soldiers, a tall sergeant with U.S. Army stitched above his pocket, offered Hoffmann a canteen of water. "Hot day," he said simply. Hoffmann hesitated, unsure if it was some sort of mockery. But the sergeant nodded once and moved on, offering the same to another captive. The gesture unsettled Hoffmann more than the defeat itself. Hours later, under the dying sun, the convoy rumbled west toward the Allied encampment near Gafsa. The prisoners sat in silence, the rhythmic hum of the engines punctuated only by the clatter of gear. Hoffmann looked out the back of the truck, watching the endless desert roll by, his thoughts spiraling. For the first time in his life, the certainties that had defined his world, Aryan superiority, racial hierarchy, the supposed order of civilization, began to crack. He had been taught that black men were savages, incapable of discipline or intellect. Yet here they were, organized, commanding, and carrying out their duties with quiet authority. As night fell over the Tunisian desert, the prisoners arrived at a temporary American compound. Barbed wire fences glinted under searchlights. The Americans, efficient as ever, divided the captives into groups, took names, and distributed rations. And then, another shock. The same black sergeant appeared again, clipboard in hand, calling out names with clear authority. Even the white American MPs deferred to his commands. When Hoffmann's name was called, the sergeant looked up. "Lieutenant Hoffmann? You're going to Camp 3. Step forward." For a moment, Hoffman couldn't move. The voice, the authority, it felt like the world had tilted on its axis. As he obeyed, stepping out into the harsh glare of the searchlights, one thought burned in his mind. If this is what America allows its inferiors to become, then what else have we been lied to about? The convoy would soon set sail for America. And for many German prisoners, men like Hoffman, the greatest shock was still to come. May 1, 1943. Newport News, Virginia. After 12 days at sea aboard the Liberty ship SS William Paca, the German prisoners finally caught sight of the American coastline. Through the gray morning mist, the dockyards of Virginia appeared, massive cranes, rows of trucks, and warehouses humming with activity. For many of the prisoners, it was their first glimpse of the United States, the enemy they had been told was weak, decadent, and racially divided. Lieutenant Karl Hoffmann stood on the deck, surrounded by other captured officers. The salty wind whipped through their hair, carrying the metallic tang of machinery and the faint hum of swing music drifting from somewhere on shore. Below deck, hundreds of enlisted men murmured quietly, their voices tense with anticipation. The American guards, mostly young GIs, shouted orders crisply but without cruelty. And again, Hoffman saw what unsettled him most. Among them were African American soldiers, performing duties alongside their white comrades with the same authority and ease. One, a corporal from the Transportation Corps, was directing the unloading operation. White soldiers followed his gestures without hesitation. Riedel, still at Hoffman's side, whispered, "It's like everything Goebbels said, was a lie." Hoffman didn't answer. He only watched as a group of black dockworkers waved to the soldiers, laughing and trading jokes in English too fast to follow. The atmosphere was efficient, yes, but relaxed, confident, unafraid. The Germans were marched down the gangway under heavy guard. Cameras flashed, American journalists documenting the arrival of thousands of Axis prisoners. Hoffman squinted against the sun and saw children waving small flags from the docks. Some even clapped as the prisoners passed, though whether in triumph or curiosity, he couldn't tell. The prisoners were herded into waiting trucks for transport to the train station. There, they boarded long, steel railcars marked U.S. Army Transport. The journey across the American heartland would take days, and for Hoffman, it would become an unforgettable education in a world utterly unlike the one he had imagined. As the train rumbled westward, the landscape changed, from the coastal ports of Virginia through the green hills of Tennessee, then into the vast plains of Oklahoma. The prisoners sat staring through barred windows, seeing America in motion, factories roaring, farmers working, small towns buzzing with life. In one town, Hoffman saw something that froze him. At a railway stop, a group of black and white soldiers stood together on the platform, sharing cigarettes, laughing. An officer, white, handed a paper bag of food to a black private and patted his shoulder. No sneering. No separation. No disgust. It was as if the laws of nature, as Hoffman had been taught them, no longer applied. He turned to Riedel. "Do you see that?" he asked quietly. Riedel nodded. "They treat them like equals." The thought lingered long after the train had moved on. By the time the prisoners arrived at Camp Shelby, Mississippi, one of dozens of POW camps scattered across the United States, rumors were spreading among the Germans. Some said they would be treated like kings, others like criminals. But none were prepared for what they found. Camp Shelby was enormous, rows of wooden barracks surrounded by barbed wire, guard towers, and floodlights. But it wasn't the camp that captured Hoffman's attention. It was the people. The guards at the main gate were members of a segregated African American military police unit. Their uniforms were immaculate, their boots polished to a mirror shine. One of them, a sergeant named William Carter, was reading a newspaper while leaning against a jeep. When the German trucks rolled in, he folded the paper neatly, motioned to the driver, and called out to the officer in charge. "All clear, Lieutenant. Bring them through." His tone was professional, confident. Inside the camp, the prisoners were processed, fingerprinted, and assigned bunks. Hoffman noticed that Carter and his men ran the intake station like clockwork. Each German was issued clothing, blankets, and a small kit. And when one of the prisoners muttered something derogatory under his breath in German, Carter's calm expression didn't change. He simply ordered him to step aside and had him searched again, no different than he would any other man. That composure, that quiet authority, disturbed Hoffman more than open hostility ever could. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the pines of Mississippi, the Germans sat in their barracks, talking in hushed tones. "Did you see the black sergeant?" one said. "He was giving orders to white soldiers. They followed him without question." "It's propaganda," another insisted weakly. "It must be for our benefit, to humiliate us." But even as they spoke, they could hear the laughter of the American guards outside. White and black voices mingled freely under the floodlights. Music played from a radio. It wasn't an act. It was normal life. Hoffman lay awake on his cot, staring at the ceiling. Back in Germany, his teachers had told him that America was collapsing under racial chaos. Yet here, the chaos was functioning better than anything the Reich had managed in its final years. The realization didn't come all at once. But deep down, he knew, the foundations of his belief were cracking. And in the weeks that followed, those cracks would widen into a chasm. June 1943. Camp Shelby, Mississippi. The days settled into a rhythm. Every morning, the prisoners were woken at 6 a.m. by the sound of the bugle and the distant murmur of American guards starting their shifts. Breakfast was plain but plentiful: eggs, bread, coffee. The German POWs couldn't help but notice that their meals were better than what many of them had eaten during the final months in North Africa. And what surprised them most wasn't just the food. It was the order, the quiet efficiency with which the Americans ran everything. Work details were organized with military precision. Groups of German POWs were assigned to repair roads, cut timber, or tend crops under supervision. Guards, both white and black, rotated shifts, often working side by side. The Americans treated the Germans not as conquered enemies, but as men, expected to obey, but not degraded. For Hoffman and others raised on years of Nazi indoctrination, that small distinction was revolutionary. On one humid morning, Hoffman's detail was led by Sergeant William Carter, the same African-American MP who had overseen their arrival weeks earlier. Carter, tall and composed, wore his uniform with quiet pride. His tone was clipped but respectful as he gave instructions. "You'll be clearing that stretch of road today. Keep your helmets on. Watch for snakes." The Germans obeyed, though not without glances of discomfort. Some avoided eye contact altogether. Hoffman noticed one of his men, a die-hard party loyalist named Vogel, glaring at Carter with thinly veiled contempt. When Carter approached, Vogel muttered in German, a monkey giving orders. Carter's eyes flicked toward him. "Something to say, soldier?" Hoffman froze. Vogel straightened his back, smirking slightly, assuming the man wouldn't understand. Carter, without missing a beat, replied in perfect, calm English, "Didn't think so." Then he turned and continued his inspection. Hoffman's stomach twisted. Not out of fear, but out of shame. Later that afternoon, during a water break, Carter noticed Hoffman watching him. "You ever been to school in America?" Carter asked suddenly. Hoffman blinked, uncertain if it was a trick. "No," he said haltingly. "Only, what we were taught." Carter nodded slowly, as if he already knew. "Yeah. I imagine they didn't teach you much about men like me." There was no anger in his voice, only quiet certainty. Hoffman didn't reply. But as he worked through the afternoon sun, Carter's words lingered longer than the heat itself. By July, the POWs had begun to adjust to American camp life. The guards weren't brutal; in fact, they often engaged in casual conversation with the prisoners. Many Germans were astonished to learn that they could send letters, receive Red Cross packages, even attend classes in English and mechanics. In the evenings, they could hear swing music from the guard station. Sometimes, to the disbelief of the German officers, they heard jazz. One night, a warm breeze carried the sound of Louis Armstrong's trumpet across the camp. Several German soldiers stood outside, listening. One of them scoffed, "This is Negro music, savage stuff." But Hoffman said nothing. The longer he listened, the more he felt something strange, admiration. The rhythm, the energy, the confidence. It was as disciplined, in its own way, as any military march. He thought of Carter again, of the effortless authority in his posture, the respect his men gave him. It made sense now. The next morning, Hoffman saw something that shook him even further. A white lieutenant was arguing with another officer near the gate. Carter approached, saluted sharply, and the lieutenant turned to him. "Sergeant, take over this post." "I'm headed to headquarters." "Yes, sir," Carter replied, and as the officer walked off, Carter began issuing orders to both white and black guards, seamlessly. No hesitation. No rebellion. No resentment. To the American soldiers, it was ordinary. To the Germans, it was incomprehensible. In the camp library, some of the prisoners began reading American newspapers and magazines provided by the YMCA. They found articles about the war, politics, and even sports. One afternoon, Hoffman flipped through a copy of Life magazine and froze at a photo, an African-American pilot standing proudly beside a P-51 Mustang. The caption read, "Lieutenant Charles Hall of the Tuskegee Airmen, first Negro pilot to shoot down a German aircraft." Hoffman stared at it for a long time. When he showed it to Riedel, his friend whispered, "They even let them fly?" Hoffman nodded slowly. "And win." For days afterward, he couldn't shake the image of that smiling pilot. He imagined the propaganda films back home, the jeering voiceovers mocking American racial degeneracy. Now he saw the truth. Men like Hall, like Carter, were proof of something his homeland had tried to deny, the universality of courage, of intellect, of dignity. One night, after lights out, the Germans lay awake listening to the crickets outside. Riedel spoke softly from the next bunk. "Do you think they'll ever treat us this way in Germany, the Jews, I mean?" Hoffman didn't answer immediately. The question cut deep. For the first time, he realized how far the Nazi vision had warped his soul, how it had stripped even compassion from his vocabulary. "I don't know," he said finally. "But maybe, they already should have." Outside, under the glow of the floodlights, Sergeant Carter walked his usual patrol, his shadow stretching long across the barracks. To the captured Germans, he was no longer an anomaly. He was a contradiction that refused to be denied, living proof that their war had been built on lies. August 1943. Camp Shelby, Mississippi. By late summer, the Mississippi air hung heavy with humidity, thick as syrup and filled with the buzz of cicadas. The POW camp had settled into a strange sort of peace. Though thousands of miles from home, many of the German soldiers found their lives safer, cleaner, and better fed than they ever had been on the front lines. But for Lieutenant Karl Hoffman, the comfort came with disquiet. Each day seemed to challenge a different piece of the ideology that had once defined him. In the barracks, men began receiving letters from home, censored, of course, but still precious fragments of Germany. Hoffman's first letter came in mid-August. His sister wrote from Hamburg, her neat handwriting trembling from strain. She spoke of shortages, bombings, and whispered doubts about Hitler, about the war, about everything. But she also mentioned something else. "Rumors reach us," she wrote, "that our soldiers in America are being treated well, some even working alongside colored men. I can hardly believe it. Is it true?" Hoffman stared at the letter for a long time. He wanted to write back and deny it, to tell her it was Allied propaganda. But he couldn't. Because every day, he saw it with his own eyes. One afternoon, Hoffman was assigned to help at the camp's woodworking shop, a large shed where POWs repaired tables, chairs, and crates for the U.S. Army. The shop's supervisor was a middle-aged black foreman named Mr. Jameson, a civilian contractor who wore a sweat-stained fedora and carried himself with quiet confidence. "Morning, fellas," Jameson said as the German work crew entered. His tone was warm but firm. "You break it, you fix it. And if you don't know how, you ask." The Germans exchanged wary glances. Hoffman waited for the tension he expected, for someone to mock or resist. But to his surprise, Jameson's easy authority disarmed them. He worked alongside them, showing them how to use American tools and machinery, joking occasionally in a southern drawl that Hoffman could barely understand but somehow appreciated. "Sergeant Carter tells me you boys know your stuff," Jameson said, adjusting a clamp. "That true?" Hoffman hesitated. We are engineers." "Or were." Jameson smiled faintly. "Well, then you'll do just fine. Wood doesn't care where you're from." The simple line, "Wood doesn't care where you're from," stayed with Hoffman for weeks. Under Jameson's guidance, the German prisoners found themselves laughing, working efficiently, even competing to see who could build the sturdiest table. Jameson treated them as capable men, not enemies. When one of them accidentally dropped a hammer and cursed, Jameson chuckled. "Don't worry, son. I've said worse." There was no malice. No resentment. Only a shared focus, craft, skill, and dignity. That evening, Hoffman returned to his bunk and pulled out his sister's letter again. The words about colored men seemed to pulse in his mind. He reached for the small writing kit issued by the camp and began drafting his reply. "Dear Anna. What you have heard is true. The men you call colored serve here as soldiers, guards, and workers. They are treated with respect, even authority. I have seen a black sergeant command white men without hesitation. I have spoken with one, Sergeant Carter, who carries himself with greater discipline and grace than many German officers I've known. If our people could see what I have seen, they would begin to question everything. I already have." He paused, staring at the ink before adding. "Do not believe all that you are told, Schwester. The world is not as we were taught it to be." He folded the letter, sealing it with a trembling hand. By September, Camp Shelby's POW education program began. American officers and civilian volunteers offered optional classes in English, geography, and even democracy, part of what the U.S. Army called re-education. Most Germans attended out of boredom, but some, like Hoffman, came out of curiosity. The instructor for Hoffman's class was a young African-American teacher named Miss Evelyn Walker, a college graduate from Chicago. She carried herself with poise and intellect that captivated the room. "Today," she began one morning, "we're going to talk about the Constitution of the United States, and what it means when we say all men are created equal." The phrase struck like thunder. The room fell silent. Miss Walker smiled faintly. "I know," she said, "some of you don't believe that. Some of you were taught the opposite. But I'm here, teaching you, so you can see for yourselves what that promise looks like, even when we're still fighting to make it real." Her voice was calm but firm. Hoffman couldn't take his eyes off her. The confidence, the articulation, it shattered every stereotype he had been fed. During a break, he approached her. "Fräulein Walker," he said carefully, "in Germany, they teach that your people cannot." She held up a hand gently. "I know what they teach." Her smile softened. "And now you know it's wrong." Hoffman lowered his eyes. "Yes," he said quietly. "Now I know." That night, the barracks buzzed with uneasy conversations. Some prisoners refused to believe what they were seeing. "This is all theater," one insisted. The Americans do it to confuse us. Maybe, another replied, but even if it is, they play it well. Hoffman said nothing. He only looked out through the narrow window at the guard post, where Sergeant Carter was chatting with Miss Walker, both laughing softly beneath the glow of a lantern. Two people who, in Nazi Germany, would have been invisible. Here, they ran the camp. And it worked. As autumn settled over Mississippi, Hoffman felt something break loose inside him, like a heavy stone rolling away from his chest. He no longer saw Carter or Jameson or Miss Walker as symbols, but as people, intelligent, capable, deeply human. And with that realization came something deeper, shame. He thought of the Jews his regiment had escorted through Tunisia, the civilians beaten, the ones who vanished. He thought of the slogans he had repeated, the speeches he had applauded. All of it built on the same lie now unraveling before his eyes. America was not perfect, he saw the signs of segregation even here, beyond the fences. But within the walls of this camp, equality wasn't a slogan. It was lived, imperfectly, defiantly, but undeniably. And for men like Karl Hoffman, that truth would change everything. October 1943. Camp Shelby, Mississippi. Autumn came softly to the American South. The air grew cooler, the pine trees whispered under the wind, and the camp's daily routine slowed with the shortening days. But inside the minds of the German prisoners, a different kind of season was unfolding, one of confusion, reflection, and awakening. For Lieutenant Karl Hoffman, the transformation was no longer subtle. He found himself looking forward to his duties, to the simple rhythm of work under Sergeant Carter and Mr. Jameson, to the quiet conversations with Miss Walker in the classroom. The world that had once seemed clear and ordered, Aryans on top, others beneath, now appeared fragile and absurd. Yet not all prisoners were ready to abandon what they had been taught. One evening, after roll call, Hoffman was approached by Oberfeldwebel Kurt Vogel, the same man who had once sneered at Carter during a work detail. Vogel was a devoted Nazi, sharp-eyed and bitter about captivity. "You've gone soft, Hoffman," he muttered, glancing around to be sure no guards were near. "I hear you write letters praising the Americans. Even the Negroes. Have you forgotten who you are?" Hoffman stiffened. "I haven't forgotten," he said quietly. "But I have learned." "Learned what?" "That we should kneel to them? That we were wrong all along?" Vogel's tone dripped with contempt. "You let their propaganda get to you." Hoffman turned to face him fully. "You think propaganda can make a man decent? Can make him treat prisoners with dignity? Can make him share his water in the desert, when he doesn't have to?" Vogel's jaw tightened. "You're blinded. The Führer warned us." "The Führer lied," Hoffman said, his voice steady. "He lied to all of us." For a moment, neither man spoke. The silence between them was thick and dangerous. Finally, Vogel spat on the ground and walked away. That night, Hoffman wrote in his journal, something the camp allowed for officers. The entry was brief but telling. "Today I realized that the war may have ended for me months ago, not when I was captured, but when I saw Sergeant Carter offer a prisoner water. No ideology can survive the sight of kindness." In November, the Americans began moving small groups of prisoners to work on nearby farms. It was a way to replace labor lost to the draft. Hoffman volunteered, partly to escape the monotony of camp life, partly to see more of America. The truck drove them out past pine forests and into open farmland, fields of cotton and soy, dotted with small wooden houses. At one of these farms, Hoffman's group was greeted by an older black farmer named Elijah Turner and his wife, Mary. They had lived through decades of segregation, yet they greeted the German prisoners without fear. "Morning, boys," Elijah said, tipping his hat. "We'll be picking till sundown. You keep up, we'll all eat good tonight." Hoffman blinked in disbelief. "We'll all eat good tonight. Not, you'll eat last, not, you'll get scraps. They were being treated as equals in labor. Throughout the day, Elijah worked alongside them, his hands strong, his pace steady. He sang softly as he worked, old spirituals that rose and fell like prayers on the wind. At first, the Germans didn't join. But by midday, one began humming along. By sunset, even Riedel was trying to catch the rhythm. When they finished, Mary served cornbread, beans, and sweet tea from a battered pot. She handed Hoffman a plate with a warm smile. "Ain't much," she said, "but it's honest food." Hoffman bowed slightly, the way he might have to a lady back home. "It is more than enough." "Thank you." She chuckled. "Well, ain't you polite for a German soldier?" He hesitated. "Maybe I am learning." That evening, as they rode back to camp, the sky turned crimson over the cotton fields. Hoffman leaned back against the truck bed, the wind cool against his face. He had just eaten dinner cooked by a black woman, something his upbringing would have called impossible. Yet here, it had felt completely natural. He thought of his mother's warnings, his teacher's lectures, and the speeches that promised a pure world. Now, all he could see was the absurdity of it, and the quiet, radiant truth that decency had no color. Winter came early that year. By December, a chill wind swept through the camp. The guard set up a Christmas tree in the mess hall, and surprisingly, invited both German prisoners and American personnel to share in a small holiday gathering. The room was filled with the scent of pine and coffee. American soldiers, white and black alike, mingled easily, laughing as the Germans sang Still Nacht in low harmony. Sergeant Carter stood near the back, clapping along softly. After the singing, Carter approached Hoffman with 2 cups of coffee. "Merry Christmas, Lieutenant," he said with a small grin. Hoffman accepted the cup, unsure how to respond. "In Germany," he said, "we are told you have no faith, no morals. But I see now that isn't true." Carter smiled. "Faith isn't something a man can keep from another. Either you live it, or you don't." They stood in silence for a moment, listening to the laughter and music around them. "You know," Hoffman said quietly, "when I first saw you, I thought the world had turned upside down." Carter chuckled. "Maybe it did. But sometimes that's how it gets set right again." That night, Hoffman wrote his final journal entry of the year. "America is not perfect. I see their walls, their divisions, even here. But in this camp, in Carter, in Walker, in Jameson, in the Turners, I have seen what my country claimed did not exist: equality, decency, and humanity shared between races. Perhaps the greatest victory America ever won was not on a battlefield, but in the hearts of her enemies, by showing them the truth." He closed the notebook and lay back on his cot. Outside, the floodlights hummed softly, and faintly, he could hear Carter's voice carried by the wind, laughing with another guard, the sound easy and human. For the first time since his capture, Hoffman slept peacefully. And somewhere deep inside him, the last remnants of the Reich's poison finally began to die. March 1946. Bremerhaven, Germany. The wind off the North Sea bit cold against Karl Hoffman's face as he stepped down from the transport ship USS General W.P. Richardson. The war was long over. The flags had changed, the uniforms were gone, and the world he had once known, the Reich that promised 1,000 years, had turned to ash. He was thinner now, older in the eyes, but his posture still bore the quiet discipline of a soldier. In his satchel, alongside the sparse belongings allowed on the voyage home, was a small notebook, the journal he had kept since Tunisia. Its pages held not only his observations of war, but something else, a record of transformation. Around him, hundreds of other German POWs shuffled down the gangway in silence. Some wept quietly when they saw the ruined skyline of Bremen to the south, flattened buildings, scorched earth, a landscape stripped bare by Allied bombing. The homecoming they had dreamed of was a ghost. And yet, for Hoffman, there was a strange peace in the devastation. The old order had died. something new could grow. The Allied officials processed the returning POWs quickly. After fingerprinting and questioning, they were handed ration cards and travel passes. The Americans, the same enemy who had captured and fed them, were now supervising their repatriation with the same efficiency and fairness they had shown in the camps. As Hoffman waited in line, he overheard two men ahead of him whispering. "Did you hear? They say the Americans have Negro officers in Germany now, part of the occupation forces. That can't be true." "It is. I saw one driving a jeep in Frankfurt." Hoffman almost smiled. He could picture it perfectly, Sergeant Carter in his pressed uniform, stepping out of a jeep, unbothered by the stares. The thought filled him with quiet satisfaction. Weeks later, Hoffman found his way to Hamburg, where his sister Anna still lived. Her small apartment overlooked a street of broken buildings and makeshift markets. When he arrived at her door, she barely recognized him. "Karl," she gasped, pulling him into an embrace. "You're alive." He smiled weakly. Alive, and changed. Over tea, she told him of the hunger winters, of the rubble-clearing brigades, of the trials in Nuremberg. When she asked what America had been like, he fell silent for a long moment, staring into the cup in his hands. Finally, he said, "They defeated us in a way we never expected. Not just with bombs or armies, but with how they treated us. Even their Negro soldiers treated us better than we treated our own people." Anna blinked. "Negro soldiers?" "Yes." He leaned forward, eyes distant. "I saw men with darker skin than ours wear the same uniform, command the same respect. I saw them teach, lead, laugh. And they did it with dignity. They were not inferior, they were free." Anna looked down, uncertain how to respond. He continued softly, I think that's why they won. Because they fight for an idea, not a race." That summer, Hoffman found work with a reconstruction team repairing roads near Bremen, the kind of labor he had once directed soldiers to perform in Africa. He didn't complain. Every swing of the hammer, every stone laid, felt like penance. Among the workers were displaced persons, Poles, Czechs, and a few black French colonial troops from Senegal helping with Allied logistics. To his own surprise, Hoffman greeted them easily, offering cigarettes and conversation. One of the Senegalese soldiers, a cheerful corporal named Diop, smiled and said in rough German, "You were prisoner, yes? In America?" Hoffman nodded. "Yes. For 3 years." Diop grinned. "Then you know, Americans different. They feed you, even laugh with you." "Yes," Hoffman said quietly. "And they make you question everything." That night, in the workers' dormitory, Hoffman opened his old journal again. The pages were worn, smudged with dust from Mississippi and salt from the Atlantic. Near the back, he found the final entry he had written before leaving the camp. "If I ever return home, I will tell them the truth. That I met men with dark skin who carried themselves with more honor than I ever did. That equality is not weakness. That kindness is not defeat. And that the greatest victory of America was not the surrender of our armies, but the surrender of our hatred." He read the words again, his chest tightening. Then he took out his pencil and added one last note. "I once believed the world was divided by color, by blood, by destiny. Now I know it is divided only by those who see others as human, and those who do not." He closed the book and set it beside his cot. Outside, the night wind swept through the broken city, carrying with it the faint sounds of hammers and rebuilding. Somewhere beyond the harbor, the lights of an Allied patrol jeep flickered in the distance, and for a fleeting moment, Hoffman imagined he saw the silhouette of Sergeant Carter behind the wheel, still standing guard over a world that might, at last, learn to live without walls. Months later, when Allied authorities began interviewing former POWs about their experiences, Hoffman told his story. Not all wanted to hear it. Some dismissed it as defeatism. Others listened in stunned silence. But a few, younger, war-weary, uncertain, took his words to heart. One day, a student from Hamburg University approached him after a lecture and asked, "Do you really believe people can change, Herr Hoffmann?" Hoffmann smiled faintly. "I have seen it," he said. "In others, and in myself." He didn't mention the Mississippi nights, or the jazz that floated through the camp, or the quiet dignity of a black sergeant offering water to his captives. Those memories were his alone, small, sacred proofs that humanity could survive even in war's darkest places. As he walked home that evening, the air smelled of rain and coal smoke. Children played among the ruins, their laughter echoing down the alleyways. And for the first time since before the war, Karl Hoffmann allowed himself to believe, not in victory, not in empire, but in decency. Something simple. Something human. The kind of truth no regime could ever destroy.